Hello. Today we're going to look at why I love weeds. So let's start with a definition of a weed. What is a weed? Following that, we'll look at some of the very negative points about weeds, which most of us know already. But then we're going to look at some of the positive points and the reasons why I love weeds. So let's kick off with a definition. What is a weed? Well, the definition of a weed is very simple. It's simply a usually wild plant growing where it is not wanted. It's as simple as that. So we now have our definition. It's basically a plant growing somewhere we don't want it to grow. So let's look at some of the negative points we associate with weeds. Now, the first one that springs to mind is gardeners tend to think that weeds compete for soil resources with their domestic plants. They're also thought to smother or shade out the plants that we're trying to grow. And there's another thing which may or may not be known by many people. There's a thing called negative allelopathy. Now, this is a very fancy way of saying certain plants will actually transmit into their environment chemical compounds which inhibit the germination or the growth of other plants. It's a way of eliminating competition, and there are certain plants that do that. One I can think of as a good example is, for example, a walnut tree. And one last thing when we think about weeds, it may simply be that it disrupts your visual harmony. For example, if you have a bed of red plants and then suddenly there's a little weed with a yellow flower that grows in the middle of your bed, it tends to disrupt the harmony a little. Or perhaps on a perfectly green lawn you'll have something like a dandelion growing in the middle. So there, that's a quick tour of some of the negative points of weeds, or simply wild plants, as I'd prefer to call them. So let's look at some of the positive points. Now, the first point is this. Some wild plants are very, very attractive. Just think of a clearing in the woods full of bluebells, or a field full of buttercups, or perhaps daisies. So again, it can be an extremely attractive sight. Another thing is these wild plants will attract predators and pollinators to your green space. Now, the predators I'm talking about are the little organisms that will predate on the pests that are maybe attacking your domestic plants. And pollinators, well, we can think of a few, but think of bees, bumblebees, and so on and so forth. Note also that these hardy little weeds will be flowering, fruiting, and producing food for our friendly predators and pollinators during the periods when there is very little food to be had, such as the autumn, winter, and early spring. Wild plants can also act as a living mulch. We don't like to have bare ground in the garden because what will happen is the soil will be dried out by the sun or washed away by the rain, or once it is dried out by the sun, blown away by the wind. So we lose very valuable growing medium, which is our soil. So plants, wild plants, or even domestic plants, but here we're talking about weeds, will actually grow on the soil, protect it from the rays of the sun and the beating rain, and will stabilize it so it doesn't disappear. In so doing, they provide biomass. Now, what I mean by this is they're actually producing green material here, which will, once it's dead, i.e. cut down or simply at the end of its growing period, will provide very important nutrients above the soil and also below the soil where the roots are, to again add nutrition to your soil. So they're a way of enriching the soil that we have. They're also often edible for us and for pets. So let's think of things like hazelnut or blackberries, for example. Another thing I'd like to mention, we can use them as companion plants. That is to say, we can be growing them next to our food crops, such that they will mask the smell of our food crop to its pests. This way we have a kind of camouflage so the pests can't find it, and our food crop is protected by this weed. Another thing, sometimes they can be what I call sacrificial plants, such that they attract the little pests which leave our food crop alone. For example, I had a situation where I had a weed, I think it was something like a ragwort or something like that, growing next to a tomato plant. My tomato plant did not have a single aphid on it. However, this plant next to it, this weed or this wild plant, was covered in aphids. So it had attracted all the aphids and it was being consumed by the aphids, which left my tomato plant in perfect health. What else can I tell you? I think the last point I can think of off the top of my head is this. Wild plants, i.e. weeds, are free. They don't cost you anything. They arrive in your garden on their own, and there's no real maintenance involved, no real work involved in cultivating them. So again, a nice little advantage there too. So now, conclusion. The reason I love wild plants, certainly weeds, is because of the advantages I've just listed. So I'm hoping that in future you will be a little kinder to your weeds and maybe learn to manage them well with your domesticated plants in your green space.